Coming up on today's show, we're going to be talking public debt with former MEP and scourge of the politically correct Godfrey Bloom. Then we've got Greg Swenson from Republicans Abroad talking about Trump and the risk to NATO from the left. Hello and welcome to No Holds Barred with me, Andre Walker. Now, each political party is talking about an end to austerity in this election, as if that were sensible. Party leader after party leader have queued up to outbid each other with colossal spending plans. Labour not only pledged 83 billion in their manifesto, but the very next day they added 58 billion to the total. What leaders forget is that even under austerity, this country was acquiring debt. Britain wasn't being frugal. We were living beyond our means. Governments seem incapable of understanding what every family in this country knows. You can only spend what you've got, and you cannot spend your way out of debt. Our leaders seem hell-bent on maxing out the government's credit card, then doing a runner to the House of Lords for a gold-plated retirement, once again paid for by you, the taxpayer. This is the Christmas present election. And after every Christmas comes the January hangover. And if experience has taught us anything, then it is that the biggest risk to public services, to national prosperity, and to the UK's international standing is public debt. The public need to take this into account when voting. That was this week's Talking Point, and joining me to discuss it is legendary former MEP Godfrey Bloom. Godfrey, welcome.
Hello. Thank you for bringing me on.
So, are you concerned about debt?
I've been concerned for some time. Debt is expensive, and this talk of austerity that we've had, because we haven't had austerity at all, and the national debt has doubled actually under this Conservative administration. They inherited a lot of debt, and it's managed to double itself. But of course, most of it, all governments are the same, of any political hue, they squander money. And now, of course, we have debt which is approaching round about 5 trillion. It's rather difficult to get a handle on exactly what it is. But if the Taxpayers Alliance and the Institute of Economic Affairs, very trustworthy organisations, reckon it about 5 trillion. Well, 5 trillion. What does 5 trillion mean? Because that kind of figure is out of...
It's astonishing. It doesn't mean anything.
The man in the pub can't understand that. Well, I'm the man in the pub. In fact, I'm nearly always in the pub. I don't understand it. 5 trillion is just too many noughts.
Yes.
But if you divide the number of people in the country, men, women and children, it works out somewhere in the region of £100,000 for each man, woman and child in the country.
Wow.
So it's absolutely, totally out of control. And of course, national debt is the truth that dare not speak its name at election time, because elections are about bribing people with their own money. So we have a disastrous situation. It's clocking up. And of course, it costs money to service. Servicing the debt is around about £38 billion a year, and that's more than we spend on our defence budget. And this is with all-time record low interest rates.
But don't we try and confuse the public by getting them... by not explaining the difference between debt and deficit? Can you just nail that for us now so we all understand?
Yes, deficit is what we bring in every year, what the government brings in and what they spend. And of course, they always overspend. They spend more money than they bring in. And they've done that nearly every year since the war, I think with the exception of 1989. So the problem that we have is that all governments do it. And they boast that the overspend this year was only 20 billion. And the government are boasting that they got it down to 20 billion. Well, you try that with your local bank manager and see how that one goes down. And of course, the debt, as it clocks up all those 20 billions, 30 billions, of course, you're beginning to talk about real money. So, and that's a national debt. And nobody really cares much about it because it's going to be handed on to the next generation. So it really is appalling.
But hang on, Godfrey. If I look at this election, it's the next generation that seems so obsessed with putting the bill up. Don't young people understand the danger of any of this?
No, and why should they? Because it's free stuff, you know. And if you're young, and I was young, I know looking at me today, that's almost impossible to believe, but I was young. And of course, you live with parents. You're subsidised by your parents, and you go to university or whatever it is. You're constantly being subsidised, and you think there is such a thing as free stuff. if I had my way, I would ban the word free. I would not allow anybody, politicians, mainstream media, to use the word free. I would have it substituted with borrowed or taxpayer funded. And then the message might get home. But, trying to tell young people about free stuff for the national debt, they're just not going to listen.
Well, I always compare Jeremy Corbyn to Father Christmas because he walks around with a beard handing out toys to kids. But of course, what the children don't understand about Father Christmas is somebody paid for those presents.
Exactly.
And people do not kind of appreciate that.
Yeah.
But look, what are we going to do politically about this? Because even the Conservatives are now promising to end austerity. And as you quite rightly point out, austerity didn't involve paying off the debt. It just included making it bigger more slowly.
Exactly. And of course, the debt isn't shown. When the Chancellor stands up at the dispatch box to give his budget speech, he's not giving the numbers as it would be in an international accounting standards. It's fake. And if he did that, if it was UK PLC, he'd go to prison because he doesn't take into consideration pensions, public sector pensions, private funding initiatives and all the other things that should be there. So he's pretending that debt is only 80%, say, of GDP, which is a ludicrous, GDP is a ludicrous thing, but that's another story. 80% of GDP, when in fact it's around about 300% of GDP. And of course it's not just this country, all countries are the same. The Americans are in the same mess. So, no, it is a problem. And people say, oh, what can you do? What can you do? Well, there's lots of things we can do. Because people say, oh, it's unrepayable, it will never be repaid. It can be repaid. Just think of how much money is squandered. Let's go back to that £20 billion overspent. For a start, there's £1 billion a month in overseas unaudited foreign aid.
But I've got to stop you there. You have railed against overseas aid for ages.
Yes, indeed.
And firstly, nobody's taken any notice. And secondly, you've basically been accused of being a racist for doing it.
Exactly. It's not politically correct to suggest that we shouldn't give unaudited money. And of course, now the truth is coming out. I made these observations years ago, but now we're realizing that it's money being spent on ridiculous things like trying to persuade the Chinese not to have too much salt in their food, or the Indians not to smoke, or something like that.
There was the African Spice Girls, which I thought was particularly egregious. But of course, the big problem with that, Godfrey, is this. If you set out to spend an amount of money, you will spend it. If you and I go to the pub after this, and I hope we do, and I say to you, we must spend £5,000 today, we will spend £5,000. Otherwise, we'll probably spend about 30 quid.
Well, that's right, of course, and they're trying to find ways of spending this money. They put it through charities in some cases. 40% of it goes through the European Union. It goes via charities, Oxfam, so on and so forth. And of course, if you look at the chief executive salaries, you see there in the head of Red Cross, for example, is on something like £400,000 a year. Yeah, well, we've got Miliband on $500,000 a year. So it's going into individuals' pockets. It's not going to the poor little sod in the bush in Africa. He's not getting it.
No.
The fat cats get it. It's coming back into their Swiss bank accounts.
Well, also, of course, the interesting thing is quite often what happens with Bangladesh, where these aid agencies will spend money running adverts about how terrible Bangladesh is, which kills the ability for them to get overseas investments.
Indeed, and this is one of the problems that we have. It's actually self-defeating, as if you visit these countries, and I have visited most of them in my time, I can tell you that the ordinary people that say, we don't get any of this. No. We know you send it, but we don't get it. Yes. And it's all sort of cut off a public. Okay, somebody might say, okay, that's only £12 billion a year, and we've got only, but we've got to find a lot more than that. But of course, we have quangos, 400. We have over 1,000 quangos. Which cost in the region of something like £400 billion. So they're very, very expensive. We've got high-speed rail, which looks like it's going to tip the scales at £100 billion. Yeah. We're cavalierly waving our checkbook, Boris is, to give the European Union £39 billion. No invoice, incidentally. It's not itemised. You go into a restaurant and you pay at the end of the day. You want to see coffee, brandy, etc., a bottle of wine. You want it itemised. No, this is back of a fag packet. Yes. And politicians who don't know anything about numbers, and of course spending other people's money. Marvellous.
But didn't we change under Gordon Brown and Tony Blair? We used to talk about government spending. Now they say we're investing. So they say we're investing in 400,000 nurses or whatever. And of course, an investment requires some return. But of course, if I simply spend and call it investment, it makes it sound better.
It's a very clever use of words, of course, and politicians use these bogus words all the the time. And so, yeah, this is another major problem to get people thinking about these matters. But it could be saved. We could halve the number of quangos quite easily. We could stop government waste all the time. And we could actually start knocking the debt down. It can be done. And interestingly enough, I don't know whether you know this, but in 2011, the current Chancellor put forward an idea under the 10-minute rule in Westminster. Yep. He put forward the idea that there should be a constitutional cap on government spending, and he suggested 40% of GDP, again, or 30%. It doesn't matter how you play the game. So we have a Chancellor who is very conscious of the national debt, which is a first. We haven't, well, no, okay, that's not fair. Lawson. So he does care about what, of course, he's going to do. He's going to be, that will be deeply buried because people are buying votes, it's election time and you're buying votes. But I don't think the British public are as stupid as politicians think they are. They know we're in debt, and I think they'd like to see something done about it, not all these promises.
Well, of course, if you look at austerity after 2010, you know, David Cameron did win the 2015 election and Labour were railing against austerity, and yet he nonetheless won it. So people are sophisticated.
Yes, and of course the other problem we have, one of the big spending things that we do is the NHS, more money for the NHS. It's motherhood and apple pie, isn't it? Isn't it all wonderful? Free ice cream and a little puppy dog for all the people. You know, let's do it all. Let's do the whole thing. But of course nobody talks about reform.
No.
So we have over 1 million people employed in the NHS, more than half of whom, that's 600,000 odd, 600,000 people in the NHS, have no medical qualifications. It's not about nurses or doctors or surgeons or radiographers or physiotherapists. This is about people who push paper around desks all day and get handsomely paid for it. So, I mean, yes, more money for the NHS, if you will, but not an open ticket.
But of course, there was a doctor, an oncologist at St George's Hospital in Tooting who complained about what Labour were doing, because he said, look, the private finance initiative, which was a crazy idea, meant that the NHS will pay back £100 billion for all of these new buildings. And so you can put more money into the NHS, but if you have wasted it by the way you've set up the system, then there's no point.
Well, of course, and it's not just NHS, it's Defence. It's the Ministry of Defence, which is something that I'm a little bit of specialised knowledge on. So, for example, I was at RAF Wittering a couple of years ago, and the squadron commander was telling me that you needed liquor paint, the airmen's accommodation, it needed some new lighting and new bits and pieces. And he said, I have squadron funds that can do that. And I have willing volunteers who'll come in at the weekend. And because it's RAF, they don't work at weekends, you see. But I'm ex-army, I would say that, wouldn't I? but they could do that. And he said, it's £5,000. It's a public funding initiative. The MOD estates, which is privatised, want £5,000 to change some light bulbs.
Yes.
And this, as I said before, doesn't go international. This should be an international accounting standards, but it isn't. So this is all debt. Public sector pensions, all this is debt. And for the future, index-linked pensions. Nobody has index-linked pensions anymore in the private sector. But fat cat civil servants, everybody at the town hall, and which is why rates keep going up. So yes. You've got to get these people off these index-linked pensions, which is why your rates and your taxes are going up every year. And of course, civil servants and politicians don't feel the pain. They're not feeling any of this pain. They don't get austerity.
Well, that's what frustrates me when I used to listen to people, because I worked in local government. People say, I don't mind paying a little bit of extra tax for better public services. I used to say, you're not paying for better public services. You're paying for a council official to retire age 55 on 2/3 of their final salary.
Exactly.
That's what you're paying for.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not about cleaning the streets. We don't spend any money on that.
Let me just tell you this interesting little point. I live in a tiny Yorkshire village. There's only 120 souls in the entire village. I worked out we have somewhere in the region of 9 retired civil servants or public sector employees. They all retired at 60. They're all on index-linked pensions. And I costed, because I used to do this for a living, boring, nerdy. But their pensions, those 9 people, cost the Exchequer £9 million.
Yes.
Because they're on £50,000 a year index linked. They're round about 60 or 62. You try and buy that as an annuity from the Prudential, and you'll find it costs over £1 million. And that's my tiny little Yorkshire village of 120 people, and yet it's going on across the country. It's unsustainable. But nobody's even talking. I think election time would be talking about this, wouldn't you? Nobody's even talking about it.
But you look round villages like that, because I've seen them. Funnily enough, I've got a friend of mine from Sheffield Hallam, which is the sort of outer bit of Sheffield.
Exactly. exactly where they are.
And of course, you see these people, the retired headmasters, the
Yeah.
retired local government officers, the retired, and these people are doing incredibly well for themselves.
Oh, yes,
now, good
indeed.
on them. You know, I don't have a problem with an individual having been successful in life, but the issue is that it's costing us millions and millions and millions, and there's a whole belt of the country where these people live.
I think it's over £1 trillion on its own, that particular column, if you will, in the Chancellor's accounts. And of course, when you speak to these people, it's fascinating. They speak to these people, they say, oh, just a minute, I paid for that pension, you know, and I was in service for 40 years or 35 years or whatever it is. And you find that they paid in probably a couple of £100 a month, and they actually believe that that's bought them £50,000 a year at 60.
But you often hear young people saying, well, if we can do it in the public sector, why can't we do it in the private sector? And of course the answer is, we can't do it in the public sector, it's virtually broke.
All pension schemes are broke. The public sector are funded by the taxpayer, and the private sector are underfunded because we have fake artificial interest rates which have been suppressed. So most of them are 20 to 30% underfunded, even in the private sector, because it's all based on gilt yields, and as you probably know, yields, investment yields, are what pays pensions, not the capital value per se. And of course, they're all underfunded. And if you want to get out because interest rates are low, your transfer out fee is huge because that's your discounted rate. So the pension. This pension thing is a huge accident waiting to happen, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Right, Godfrey Bloom, former MEP. Honestly, I thought Scourge of the Politically Correct was a great introduction for him. Anyway, now, video of the week. And this week, it's Rhyme Minister, the Corbyn diss by Crow. Not only does it attack Jeremy Corbyn, but it also features me. What more could you want?
Half of your politics don't make sense. You're a greedy guts, you're gonna overspend. Build my business up, I plan to ascend. Then you come along and take 10%. So many of your MPs have resigned. So okay, old man, you're losing your mind. Yeah, and I heard all about you in Abbott. Act like rabbits, left your socks on. That's a bad habit. Stay locked up, safe in the cabinet. And guess what? I got the key, you ain't having it. Gonna ruin this country, lend too much money, spend it on rubbish, leave the people all hungry. Viewers in power, number 10 on Monday. I'm with Lord Sugar, I'll be gone by Sunday. So please, people, don't.
This week saw the 70th anniversary of NATO here in London. It was a fractious affair, with most countries still refusing to pay their fair share, all whilst mocking President Trump for having the temerity to ask for rich countries like France to pay for its own defence. NATO is the bedrock of European security, but it's under threat, not from Donald Trump, but from the left. They are the ones failing to fulfil the 2% target and failing to appreciate the sacrifice of our American friends. Britain does pay our fair share, but how long will that last? With Jeremy Corbyn determined to surrender to our enemies, run down the military, he even wants a War Powers Act that would force government to waste time asking our discredited parliament's permission to take military action. So what future for British and European security? I'm joined now by Greg Swenson from US Republicans Abroad. Greg, welcome.
Good to be here, Andre.
Now, are you worried about what's going on with NATO, particularly this week?
I'm not really worried about it. You know, I didn't really love Macron's interview with The Economist a few weeks ago, but no one should be worried about this president, President Trump. You know, he's actually shaking the tree a little bit and causing and bringing a lot of attention to it. He started this 2 years ago. And it's actually worked. You know, some of the countries, not all, not enough, but you know, I think it's another 5 or 6 have hit the 2% target. There's a lot more work to do and a long way to go. But you know, what he does is he sort of exposes these things that most people haven't been paying attention to. He's done it with China in a lot of different ways, but definitely with NATO. And look, he's right. You know, the commitment's 2% of GDP. Granted, there's a lot of anemic GDPs in this part of the world, but so maybe the denominator is the one that's moving the needle on in terms of.
Well, it's always easy for Greece to spend 2%.
Exactly, that's like you and I could do that, right?
Yeah.
Look, there's a lot of work to do here, and it's important. I don't think there's any lack of commitment, obviously, from the U.S. or the U.K., but you know, I think the other countries ought to buck up a little bit.
To what extent is the American public getting sick of Europe and sick of the way that they run down America America, they have a go
Yeah.
at the president, and also demand that their security gets paid for.
Right, yeah, and that's frustrating, and that's one of the reasons that President Trump was elected, because he kind of called out a lot of this hypocrisy. Now look, I think most Europeans, or many Europeans, really like this president and love America. But it's the media and the progressive militant left get a lot of attention, or bring a lot of attention to America's great flaws, which is hysterical, because, look, the one thing that you could say about, the American cause and the American military is, we're liberators, not occupiers. It's the greater force of good. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And if people want to protest in the streets like they were burning Reagan in effigy 30 years ago, go ahead.
Well, the thing that always amazes me is that the latest Republican president, whether that be Reagan, whether that be Bush, whether that be Trump,
of course,
they're all going to cause a nuclear war.
Yeah.
They're all going to destroy the
Yeah.
world. They all want to do over the British or whatever.
Yeah.
This is the most outrageous Republican president since the last Republican president.
Right, yeah.
Is this ever going to change?
Yeah, probably not. Look, there's a history of that. I mean, it's a shame. Thank you would be more appropriate.
Yeah.
All Reagan did was liberate the Europeans from the Soviet threat, and literally liberate Eastern Europe from the Soviet Union. So, what thanks did he get? Not much. But that's not really why we do it. And so, look, if that continues, and we're always going to have criticism from the progressive militant left, and that's fine.
Okay, you say that's not why
Yeah.
you do it. So what is the business case for spending all this money on NATO?
Well, look, I think America realizes, the United States realizes that that there has to be alliances, right? Granted, we are the superpower. The U.S. is the superpower now, but there has to be alliances. It's better united. We've been protecting the shipping lanes for generations now. It's important for the world, not just for the U.S. interests. The president campaigned with a little more focus on what's good for America, and I think that's important, right? Especially to taxpayers. But I think he also understands, maybe he didn't campaign this way, but he also understands that we are the leader of the free world, and there's some responsibility that goes with that.
Yeah, I suppose when you talk about America first, and you talk about the trade war with China, I remember Steve Bannon saying that it's not so much that we've started a trade war with China, it's just we've been losing one for 20 years. But I see that as something that potentially can advantage Britain, because we have our intellectual property stolen.
Absolutely.
We are undercut by the Chinese as well.
Yeah, look, this is not a U.S. problem. This is not a trade war between the U.S. and China. This is between China and the rest of the world. They exploit every country that they trade with. They export cheap labor. They have human rights violations. They have aggressive military activity. They're a huge security risk as well as an intelligence risk. It's a long list, right? You don't even have to get to the Uyghurs. Well, you can just start with what the U.S. interests are, what the UK interests are, and really even in the region. I don't think Vietnam and Australia want to have an overgrown China or China encroaching on their borders. So.
Now, look, I know that Americans are famous for not getting into the granular detail of foreign politics, at least not ordinary American families. But what is the view of Corbyn? Is this somebody who has cut through in America? Are there concerns about him?
Absolutely, and you're right. Americans don't typically look abroad, and don't really put foreign policy at the top of the list. It's all about your pocketbook. It's why there's the largest economy in the world, and you don't really have to go into other countries to really access anything. It's a huge country, a huge economy.
Yeah, you can go skiing, or you can go to the beach.
Exactly,
you can do whatever
right.
you want.
Yeah, there's plenty to do there. And so, but it is important, and I think that Jeremy Corbyn has probably got more attention than any other opposition leader, just because he's a Marxist and he's so out there. And we have Bernie Sanders in the U.S. So those comparisons are made quite often. So I think because of the Bernie factor, and because Corbyn is so outrageous, he's getting more attention than perhaps any other Labour opposition leader would get.
Jeremy Corbyn has set out as his raison d'etre throughout his entire career to be a friend to the enemies of Britain and America.
Sure. Yeah.
Whether it be Hamas, whether it be Hezbollah, whether it be attacks on Israel, whether it be the IRA.
Yeah.
We all know that.
Hysterical.
But the Israelis have now said that if Jeremy Corbyn wins the election, they will not share intelligence with him, which I think is a sensible move.
Right.
Are there any contingency plans that you're aware of with America in that regard?
Not that I'm aware of, but it would be really controversial if he were to win, because you're right. He loves the enemies of the West. You know, I mean, even Venezuela now. I mean, look which side, you know, he took on that one. Guess who else took that side? China and Russia.
Yes.
You know, it's
well, of course.
yeah.
Just to interrupt, I mean, when the Salisbury attack happened, which is a chemical attack on the United Kingdom by Russia, completely unacceptable. You know, of course, there was Jeremy Corbyn peddling the Kremlin line.
Yeah, no, it's sad. It's really sad how a person like that, a Marxist, an enemy of the West, was able to achieve what he's achieved and to be in that position. It's really outrageous. I don't understand it. I mean, Bernie has the same kind of following in the U.S. You know, he's got a certain demographic. He honeymooned in the Soviet Union. I mean, you know, come on.
Wow.
I mean, Bermuda was not open at the time, you know. I mean, you really have to be a little bit of a nutter to actually take your new wife on a honeymoon to the Soviet Union because you have that much love for
if you like the snow.
that model. Yeah, I mean,
if you like the snow and cabbage.
Honey, let's go to the bread line, you know. It's fantastic. Or let's go to the gulag.
So what do you see as the future here? You know, are we going to be able to continue with this push that we've made, whether that be Trump not getting impeached, Brexit going through? Because there is a global movement here, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt there's a populist shift, and the people have just become fed up. This didn't start with Trump, by the way, as you know, Andre. This started in 2010 with the Tea Party movement in the U.S.
Yes.
It was the most overwhelming rejection of a president since the early 1930s, that midterm election in 2010. Yes. You know, over 60 Republicans won seats. The only reason that 2014 wasn't just as big is there weren't that many seats left to take. You know, so you know you can't really outdo 2010 again. But you know, but again, they had landslide victories for Republicans in 2014. So you know, this started in with the Tea Party movement. There has been, and globally, there's been this rejection of establishment politicians. It's probably long overdue. You know, will it continue? Probably. Has it been? You know, there's a huge pushback from the left and the establishment against it, which is a shame. You know, and you're seeing that with the impeachment. You're seeing that especially on the coast in the U.S. You know, California, Massachusetts, New York. I don't think it will work, this pushback, because you really can't stop the voter. And I think it's liberating for voters now.
Well, populist insurgency, long may it continue. That's Greg Swenson from Republicans Abroad. And now we reveal who's going to win this week's Order of Lenin. Conspiracy theorist and crazed so-called investigative journalist Carol Codswallop is this week's winner. Ms. Codswallop has been well known for ranting off about the European referendum for ages, which she has regularly claimed was rigged. Like so many people, she is unwilling, perhaps even unable, to accept the will of the British people. But this week, she was in the High Court being sued by Aaron Banks over a TED Talk, which is still available online, in which she said, and I quote, "And I'm not even going to get into the lies that Aaron Banks has told about his covert relationship with the Russian government," end quote. Unbelievably, her lawyer has denied that she was accusing Mr. Banks of wrongdoing. Apparently, she was merely arguing in favour of properly investigating allegations should they be made. If this sounds laughable, then remember that she has won awards for this nonsense. And the Order of Lenin is the latest one of these awards. Congratulations, Carol. Feel free to sell this to help finance the crippling losses you rack up by losing your court case to Aaron Banks. Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks to my guests, Godfrey Bloom and Greg Swenson. And remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell on YouTube. And you can nominate anyone for the Order of Lenin. Just put your explanation in the comment section below. Until next time, goodbye.